There we go. Okay, so welcome. This is second weekly live session on transform facilitation. And today I'm just going to jump right into it and then save some time for Q&A afterwards. But today we're focusing on two questions that every facilitator should be designing around, especially when you're trying to support the transformation of your audience. And here's the thing. Most of us, we really obsess typically over the first one. I'm really guilty of this when I first started out myself. And that mistake, honestly, when we focus on just that first question, it quietly kills transformation. But we don't often recognize it because it has a secondary effect too, because it can also earn us great feedback. So if your sessions feel polished, if they feel engaging, and if they're well liked, but you believe that nothing's actually changing afterwards, this is probably why. So when we design transformation programs, we usually ask one question over and over of ourselves. And that's, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it so people transform? And like I mentioned, I spent the first part of my career in facilitation development thinking this way too. And when we think that way, it feels responsible, it feels professional, and it even works. And if your goal is for positive evaluations, you can keep getting reinforced to keep moving in this way. But there's a problem. When we design around our delivery, we quietly take responsibility for something we actually can't control. And when that happens, we can feel the pressure to perform. We do more and more of the thinking, and our participants, the problem is here is they can become passive observers. So today I'm going to slow this down. We're going to look at two questions that actually matter in transform facilitation and why confusing them can lead to greater sessions with zero transformation. So here's the pattern. When we plan a session, most of our energy goes into that first question. That's really, what am I responsible for? What content do I need? What stories do I think will land? What frameworks will finally click? And that focus, it makes sense. It's how we're trained. It's how we go from K to 16 in our education. Butts and seats, everybody facing forward, and we're trying to internalize as much information as possible. So we're conditioned not just to learn this way sometimes, but conditioned that this is the way we all learn. And there's some learning benefits, but not necessarily as much transformation. So if that's the first question, what are we responsible for? Then what's the second question that we rarely design for? That second question is this, and this is an important one. What are participants responsible for in our sessions? And I'm not talking about in theory, I'm talking about in actual practice. So when that second question, when we're not explicit about that, we default to an unspoken agreement between us and our participants. That unspoken agreement is that if learning doesn't happen, the facilitator must fix it. We're unknowingly taking the responsibility of the learning and the transformation in that space from our participants and putting it on ourselves. Now, when we're in that mode, that agreement for us can feel really caring. It's our job, it's our role to take on, but it sets us up to do the very work participants need to do themselves. So, a quick reframe. Transformation requires these two roles to be clear, not one to be perfected. And here's a question for you to consider as you're going to your next session and you're planning it. Which responsibilities in your session are clearly theirs, and which ones quietly fall back on you? So let's talk about what happens next. When we as facilitators take on the responsibility for transformation, a few things show up fast. One, we over-explain. We rescue silence. And we try to fill every gap with something helpful, something that we think will land, something that will help their development. And like I said, this feels caring. But at the same time, we're not creating the space, creating the environment where they can have a greater chance of transformation. And I want to dispel one myth here. This isn't our incompetence as facilitators. This is a skill. We're skillful at being in front of the room and talking to our audience. But when we match that skill with pressure, we have a tendency to over deliver. Because when you believe the outcome is on you as the facilitator, the safest move is to do more. And the problem is that learning doesn't collapse because participants can't think. It collapses because they don't have to. Because when we carry the meaning making of participants, we're waiting, or I should say, they're waiting. They're waiting for the clarity to come from us. They're waiting for us to give them the takeaway. They're waiting for the right interpretation, whatever that is, to come from us. And when we're doing that, oftentimes the room can look engaged, but the learning stays abstract and we don't reach that moment of transformation that we're hoping our participants achieve. So if you're doing most of the thinking, you're also trying to do most of the developing. So welcome you to be curious and ask this question of yourself when you're developing and when you're in your session. And that's this: where in your sessions are you solving problems participants could be wrestling with instead? I'll say it again. Where in your sessions are you solving the problems that participants could be wrestling with instead? Because when our participants, when they wrestle with the concepts, and ideally also with their assumptions, that's when transformation happens. So with that, here's the uncomfortable truth. Transformation isn't about behavior first. It's about assumptions. For someone to change how they show up at work, they usually need to confront some things. What they believe keeps them safe, what they believe earns approval, and what they believe will happen if they change. And here's the thing: you can't see those assumptions easily. You can't predict them. And you absolutely can't talk people out of them, especially when you're in front of the room. You have 30 people in front of you, and every one of them has some different set of assumptions or perspectives or a different place in their developmental journey. So the question becomes is, in your role as a facilitator, it's how do you create an environment and experience for all of them to be able to navigate to and identify some of those assumptions themselves. And remember that you can't convince someone into transformation because the real work is their internal sense making. What we can do is to design experiences that invite people to examine their own assumptions. And in doing that, it requires us to give the work back to them. We as facilitators, we don't create insight, we create conditions where insight becomes unavoidable. So as you think about how you're developing your sessions, are your sessions designed for insight or for explanation? Because our role is to create opportunities for insight for them to identify themselves. So I once supported a program with a world famous transformation professor. I was a teaching assistant in this. And he said something that honestly still rocks my world today. It was a Zoom session. And in that, he described this practice that they were going to go do into breakout rooms. We sent them into breakout rooms. And this is about halfway through the program. And it's just me and this individual in the room. And he said something that surprised me. He said, Adam, even after all these years, I still feel guilty sending them into breakout groups. Guilt. This guy feels guilt sending them into breakout groups. It's not uncertainty for him. It's not inexperience. It's guilt he's feeling. And then he added something else. He said that, and this is part of his practice, after every program he does, and he's done research into this too, he does a feedback form and identifies what parts of the session were most impactful for his people, for his participants. And every time, in the top 3, every time is conversations with partners and groups. He identified through his research, and he's not the only one who's done this, that it's having those talking partners, that group work, is what supports transformation. And there's more to it, of course. But the main part of this is, what is our responsibility? What is theirs, right? Knowing how transformation happens doesn't automatically free us from the urge to manage their transformation. Like this professor still felt, but knew better. So where do your beliefs, as a facilitator, here's the question for you, where do your beliefs override what your experience already tells you works? Where are those moments where you feel compelled to over-explain or share another story when you're taking time from them to be able to process their experiences, their context, and apply that concept, whatever you're talking about, to their real world. So that's an important point, but I want to explain a little bit more about why this is so important. And the question is, what do we actually teach our participants when we over deliver? Because every time we over deliver, we're actually teaching them something. This part really matters. Because when facilitators over deliver, when we summarize too much, when we interpret too much, when we're resolving everything in the room, we teach partners something without actually saying it. We teach them that learning isn't really their responsibility, that the expert will make meaning for you, and that the solution to their problems lives in the right information. And when we do that, that's actually creating dependency. And dependency in the room, when we're facilitating, it feels good. People feel supported, sessions feel smooth, oftentimes positive feedback comes off on those forms that they fill out at the end. But development doesn't happen through dependency. It happens when people wrestle and struggle and claim their own insight from the work. When we over-explain, participants might leave impressed with us, but they don't necessarily leave changed. Transformation requires participants to experience ownership of their transformation. And sometimes that isn't necessarily clarity right away. And this next one, this took me years to realize. And that's they need agency of their transformation, not dependence. They need agency, not dependence. So here's the cleanest way I know how to explain this in terms of transformational facilitation. That's transformation isn't something you deliver. Transformation isn't something delivered. It's something you cultivate. Your responsibility in the environment, it's the questions you ask, it's the pacing, it's creating that psychological safety in the place, and it's the structure. Their responsibility. And oftentimes, and I wouldn't say naming it in this words, but naming it for them as part of your group norms is that their responsibility is the work. You can't conduct brain surgery on every one of them in the room and connect their neurons together and make the transformation. You can't do that. We can't do that. Their responsibility is the work. It's the reflection. It's the curiosity around their own meaning making, their own context, their own assumptions, and how all those play together in terms of whatever topic you're discussing. Their responsibility is the choice to change. That's not something we can do. And here's the hardest part for many of us to accept. And that's sometimes participants will use that space for transformation you didn't even plan. And that's not failure. That's evidence that the conditions worked. So in summary here, you're not here to create change. You're here to help make change possible. And a final question I'll leave you with is, what would shift in your facilitation if you were more explicit with the roles of your participants in their own development? So thanks for joining. I'm going to stop the recording here. We're going to move to Q&A, and I look forward to seeing you next week.